I guess we will start today. Welcome to the Center of Communal Studies lecture for spring 2025. And I'm very pleased to announce our guest speakers for today. And I brought you a little bit of a biography. So Ron Henderson is a landscape architect and professor of landscape architecture and urbanism at Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, where he is also the inaugural director of research for the Alpha Wood Arboretum. He is founding principal of Lirio. Landscape architecture and award-winning landscape architecture and garden practice with current work in France, Japan, and China, and of course the United States. He is the author of The Gardens of Suzhou and editor of 30 Trees and contributor of book chapters, essays, and lectures on topics from urban design and landscape architecture in Japan and China to urban design implications of driverless vehicles. He is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and U.S. National Park Service Artist in Residence, and was senior fellow of Garden and Landscape Studies at Dumbarton Oaks from 2016 to 2022. Also today's co-presenter, Michelangelo Sabatino, trained as an architect, preservationist, and historian in Canada, Italy, and the United States. He has recently been elevated to honorary fellow of the Royal Academy Institute of Canada. He is a professor of architectural history and preservation at IIT College of Architecture, where he directs the PhD program and is the inaugural John Vinci Distinguished Research Fellow. His publications and exhibitions examine the multifaceted contribution of architects and builders to modern architectures in the Americas and Europe. Sabatino's first book, Pride in Modesty, Modernist Architecture on the Vernacular Tradition in Italy, won multiple awards, including the Society of Architectural Historians, Ellis Davis Hitchcock Award. Sabatino co-authored a number of books related to Chicago since arriving to live and work in the Midwestern city. One of them, Modern in the Middle Chicago Houses from 1929 to 75, and the Edith Farnsworth House, Architecture, Preservation, and Culture. Please welcome Ron Henderson and Michelangelo Sabatino.
Thank you, Sylvia. And one thing you left out, that he's an authentic Hoosier. So go Indiana. So and a great colleague. And so thank you for inviting us and all of those here that support the magical place called New Harmony. And so today I'm just going to jump in. It is an occasion of a new book that we've been invited to speak about this. The communal aspect, I may argue, is architecture, history, preservation, and stewardship requires a family, and that in part is what we're here to discuss. So I'm just going to move quickly. The book that we're presenting today was published in conjunction with the 20th anniversary of the Edith Farnsworth House, house completed in 1951 in Plano, Illinois, opening to the public on May 15, 2004. So the 20th anniversary was last June. And so the idea was to celebrate this momentous event that finally opened the landmark house to a broader audience through the process of going from private to public. As a side note, just to sort of reorient ourselves towards the Chicago, New York, and New Harmony, Indiana, I wanted to point out, of course, the book that we did on New Harmony and Jane Blaffer-Owen, the patron client for some of the outstanding contributions in modern architecture and landscape. This, of course, is the Card Chapel, which is Mies's equivalent a decade earlier to the sort of rational contribution to the exuberance of Johnson 10 years later in New Harmony. And just to reinforce, before I jump into what my main topic of the day will be in the Farnsworth House, I just wanted to show you that given the New Harmony context, you all know who Johnson is, the sort of conflicted relationship the two had regarding the Farnsworth House, seen here in a model by Dirk Lohan, the only grandson of Mies, who studied architecture, and his 2010 model where the basically the Farnsworth and the glass house by Johnson are in this sort of cannibalistic embrace, and we'll talk about that later. And here we see Mies and Johnson in the occasion of the 1947 MoMA overview of Mies's work. And then finally, again, Johnson and Jane Blaffer Owen as they inaugurated this groundbreaking work of the roofless church just a few miles away. The idea of modern architecture dialoguing with nature at a critical juncture of the history of post-World War II is part of my underlying interest. But to the house, you're looking at this beautiful Cessna aerial taking a Cessna photo in 2004, well before drones allowed us to do this work much cheaper. It's a beautiful riverine site, the Fox River flowing through it, and agrarian lands. If you are looking hard to figure out where the house is that you come to learn about more today, and you haven't quite figured it out, I will help you. There it is. And the reason why I'm showing this is in part to sort of play around with you a little bit, but also in polemic. That is, all too often, this house has been represented as a sort of object by architectural photographers, whereas its deep sort of roots connection to the land has been overlooked. It is, in fact, a country house, not designed for year-round use. Part of the book, and we all grow, we're all works in progress as scholars, I believe, and part of the book is framework sort of has enabled me to move a little bit away from the singular focus to so-called periods of significance, i.e. when the house was originally, or a building was originally commissioned and executed, and move to a series of multiple lives, like the layers of history that allow us to understand not just the first owner / client, but a number of other protagonists that have made that house, or the building rather, have ensured that it has continued to be accessible. So the first life of this house, of course, is Edith Farnsworth, the client and patron, seen here, and then Mies van der Rohe, the German emigre architect who taught for many years at IIT and led the Department of Architecture. The second life is Lord Peter Palumbo, seen here in a dashing photo by Cecil Beaton. And finally, the third life, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the gentleman involved in the purchase and opening to the public, seen here in 2004. As a side note, I just want to give you a little bit of context in terms of the history of public access to modern single-family houses, whether full-time residence or weekend houses. To the right, far right, is of course the Glass House by Johnson, which is also one of two modern houses within the National Trust for Historic Preservation portfolio, which is a singular accomplishment given that modernism wasn't quite considered worthy of being historic, by some at least, until only recent times. The first to the far left, of course, is the Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright, and that it was really the mid-60s through the 70s, the first to really open to the public early on. And then Gropius House, Walter Gropius, Walden Pond, just outside of Cambridge. So this is a little bit of, in the landscape of houses, modern houses that are open to the public, is what, in America at least, and there would be many more to talk about, just to situate the Edith Farnsworth House within that context. So if in fact Chicago is known as a laboratory for innovation, both within the tall building and within the domestic landscape, it is in no small measure due to these two buildings. To the left, of course, is the Rohe House in Hyde Park, completed in 1911, and to the far right, our Farnsworth House, And in the middle, the two so-called giants of the room, Frank Lloyd Wright with his beret and Mies and his suit looking on a site visit. So these, much of the history of Chicago's iconic architecture is associated with these two, but we don't like to have histories of only iconic buildings. There's much richer, layered, but nonetheless, these are the two that have gone on to represent, at least outside Chicago, its top hits. Evidence, of course, is the fact that they have garnered enough attention to merit sort of their immortalization in pop culture through Lego. Now, even though these are ostensibly for children or architecture enthusiasts, the price tag associated with these is considerable, so much so that it's more adult fun than child fun. If any of you, does anyone own one of these? No. And as a side note, has anyone ever visited the Farnsworth House? Okay, so a handful. If we do our job correct, if we do our job well, Ron and I, you're going to be running to the Farnsworth House soon, I hope. So, part of the work that I did for the book is to also situate the different layers of sort of evidence of how American institutions like the MoMA, for example, were very keen on educating the public, mostly upper middle class public, as to what modern architecture was or could be. Two publications on the left, What is Modern Architecture of 1942, Edgar Kaufman's What is Modern Design, were the first examples of that. And then following with the post-World War II and onwards, where housing or single-family houses were becoming more urgent, especially in a country that values individual living over collective, alas. The folks like MoMA, If You Want to Build a House by Elizabeth Mock, were oriented not to architects, but to clients and upper middle class clients like Edith Farnsworth. So what's, I think, important of this process is that education occurs not only in the university classrooms, but through cultural institutions. And certainly they were trying to reach clients or future clients like Edith. Another fun example of a non-American perspective on this is by English architect Mayers Walker, Choosing a Modern House, published in 1939. He was at a loss to understand how Americans simultaneously choose between, say, the flat roof modernist box on the right in Ravinia, Chicagoland, and to the left, Georgian house, also in Chicago. So there was a bit of, at least amongst certain modernist architects, a bit of moralizing, finger pointing as to what was more appropriate and better. The single most important publications of that period are these: the Modern House in America, Design of Modern Interiors. And of course, these predate the Farnsworth, which was completed in 51. But just to give you a sense of how the American public is gradually educated toward the values of modern architecture, in particular, these two books, and you can tell by the white, blue, and red graphic design, were geared towards an American audience. And the point of the two authors was to show how the American architects had taken what the Europeans had shared and done in the 20s and 30s, and how they had tempered them, tailored them to an American sense of comfort and also domestic ideals. Significantly, what this two authors, Catherine Morrow, husband and wife team, and James Ford. Ford was a professor of sociology at Harvard, whereas Catherine Morrow was a journalist who wrote about architecture and interiors. So the idea that there would be a sociological underpinning to what was good about modern architecture and design is, I believe, of significance. Another fun point is that the two commissioned Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer to do this house, their house, you see on the right, also in Lincoln, Massachusetts, a 10-minute drive from Harvard. So, and Cambridge. So this was a part of a small but dedicated coterie of individuals trying to push the agenda of the modern house. Okay, fast forward. So amongst the sort of traditional interpretations of the Edith Farnsworth House are the sort of emphasis on the groundbreaking technologies that made this glass and steel house possible and radical. Of course, most Americans did not identify domesticity with sheets of glass and steel. And so that added yet another part of to the complex story. Just as a side note, you'll notice these circles along the flanges of those I-beams, right? Where I'm trying to get my pointer to work. Those are what's called plug welds. So Mies wanted to not use or not give evidence of using bolts and nuts, but rather use what was called a plug weld, that you would cut circles into the flanges and then solder. Why is that? Well, it was so that technology would almost become a sort of a sublime result. That is, you couldn't see the building coming together, and somehow it was held together by some magic force. Of course, when the other parts were out of the view of external points, he used bolts and nuts, because of course that was far less expensive. So again, the story as it goes was much of the attention was given to the materiality, the kind of harmonious sort of dialogue between machine age materials like steel and slabs of travertine, ancient natural history. And so while I include this type of layer in the book, and certainly these types of photos that show process and not just the heroic result, that's not where the novel emphasis is in this collection. It is in large part due to this woman, Dr. Edith Farnsworth, who managed to pursue both humanist-driven undergraduate education at the University of Chicago, and in 1938 was one of 5 women to graduate from the Northwestern University Medical School. And if you can see in this sea of men where she is, then you're destined to get an A in this class. Does anyone see her? There you go, right here. So clearly she played an important role, upper middle class, highly well-educated, originally from Vane family. The first scholar to really sort of point attention to Edith was, of course, Alice T. Friedman. This book, Women in the Making of the Modern House, published in 1996 for first and then second edition, sort of focused on 5 case studies in which women were not just passive clients, but actually engaged, fully engaged as patrons and clients in sort of shaping the design of their houses. As a side note, Alice Friedman was the first to work with the memoirs, and was also the first to sort of point out some of the tease out or explain the whole sort of controversies and the subsequent sexist interpretations of Edith by way of the aftermath of the lawsuit. Mies, and you see here the cover page, sued on a recommendation of Philip Johnson that we talked about early on, sued Edith for not paying all of her fees. And she, if you see up here, plaintiff and counter-plaintiff, Ludwig Mies and Rohe. And then Edith Farnsworth, defendant and counter-claimant. As a side note, back to, difficult women and lawsuits amongst architects, male mostly, I wanted to slip in, as you probably know, Jane Blaffer Owen was very courageous, and she sued Philip Johnson after 10 years because the perimeter walls of the roofless church began to disintegrate because he refused to add, for design purposes, he refused to cap the walls with a limestone cap, and therefore all the water seeped into the house and seeped into the wall, and thus causing the walls to disintegrate. So Jane also received her share of sexist interpretations based on the fact that she was bold enough to hold an architect accountable, like Johnson. But during the lawsuit, and this is again amply discussed in my essay, one of my essays in the book, important moment was also the support that Edith gained by Elizabeth Gordon, who was an important editor of House Beautiful. She too was trained at the University of Chicago, and this was published in 1953. Echoes of McCarthyism, a threat to the next America. But in that case, it wasn't communist. It was like architects that were trying to push a so-called cult of austerity, which is what Gordon felt Mies and also Le Corbusier was doing. Elizabeth Gordon complained to the reader that poor Dr. Edith Farnsworth had been forced to pay $70,000 for a one-room house on stilts. Now, the extent to which Edith was erased from the story subsequently by sexist sort of interpretations, also driven by fights over furniture, I'll explain later, is evident with this slide. This here, a photograph of Edith in her house with her beloved dog, taken by the Hungarian photographer Andrei Kertész, is the only photo that was ever published of Edith in her house, right? And not by coincidence, it was published in House and Garden, a magazine that was typically geared toward a woman audience. And they were very respectful of her. They referred to her as Dr. Farnsworth, etc. On the other hand, the magazine of Building, the Architectural Forum on the right, geared mostly to the profession, which at that time was mostly male, are barely even mention her. And so depending on where you kind of go to find your sources, her role as architect, but more than architect, patron, are discussed in varying degrees. The book also tried to add, you saw the first image on the opening slide of Edith enjoying leisurely her house, but also tried to add photos like this to the right that were not published during her lifetime because they were more taken by local photographers, and they also revealed an image of the house that this sort of Mies police did not want there to be. If you will notice the sort of two foo dogs here, basically, sorry, I got to take a little bit of a here. The two foo dogs, and also the carpets, the traditional furniture. So again, this was not an image that they wanted to show of modern architecture because it had conflicting messages, according to the architects at least. We included two visual essays that showed the house evolve over time, Edith gardening, and to the right, it's beautiful shot where the Apollonian sort of white temple emerges with its geometric perfection, emerges out of this very messy but equally beautiful meadow. The book is very heavy on photography. I joke that although I had 95% of the images for free, the other 5% costs us about $10,000 worth of copyright. So for anyone who wants to do books, know that even though they're charging $70 for the book, it's a money-losing proposition. This here to the right is perhaps the single most important photo of the house, taken shortly after its completion. It was taken by Chicago-based photographers Hedrick Blessing, William Hedrick, with Mies accompanying him. And during that period, Mies took on a very assertive role in demanding that, at least for the official photographs of his buildings, he should be present and dictate how the building should be taken. This is a one-point perspective Renaissance demanded by Mies so that you would be fully in view, no angles, perspective, multi-foci. What's significant about this image, of course, is that it is half house, even a little bit less than house, and mostly nature, right? That is, of course, again, an important part of this story. On the opposite side, I mentioned when we were looking at the aerial of the front, first image, how the kind of objectification that we see here in an image that was published to announce the sale of the house tended to take that house and make it into an object, right? And this is the kind of photos that I've tried not to use, except for showing why they were, in a way, manipulating the site or not undermining its complexity. The book also relied on a series of eclectic sources, eclectic insofar as not only traditional architectural commission photography, but a series of materials that allow one to understand the context. Right? This is a 1930 aerial view taken by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where I'm pointing here, the pointer, that's the site of the house, and up here is Plano, where it is officially, sort of the city in which it's officially located. You'll notice the Fox River Valley and the agrarian and the riverine context, right? Here is the sort of an illustration, this little parcel of land, which was part of the McCormick Tribune experimental farm, Tribune, of course, being the famous owner of the Chicago Tribune and more. And so you see a bit of how the site, the selection of the site emerged. Here, so I joke that this is a scholarly coffee table book. And if you'll permit that oxymoron, what you can understand if you read the narrative captions is that, like, here it says, like, just exactly when. So Edith purchased the land December 17th, 1945. She spent the first night in the house January 1st, 1951. That means that was 5 years. And that and much other sources of evidence allows me to say that if she were an ordinary client, and she would not have spent 6 years waiting for her house, more of a client slash patron. So there's a lot of evidence, but it's just, there's a lot of pictures too. So hence the coffee table scholarly book. Kurt Teich, of course, famous postcard producer of Chicago. I wanted to layer in the Fox River Valley, of course, where the Farnsworth is located, is also the source of a number of 19th century towns that were filled, or in part, the sites of many modern houses. So I thought that was important to add, especially for those who think that Chicago is just a loop. And I'm guilty to say that before I landed in Chicago 10 years ago, I thought Chicago was only the loop. Little did I know. Some of the material excluded Edith's own photography of the site, seen here on the right. And then, most significantly, the 3 chapters pertaining to her engagement with Mies for the house itself. Part of her unpublished memoirs, these are with other material at the Newberry Library Archives in Chicago. And so this was a really interesting moment to sort of finally allow Edith to have her own voice and to reveal what happened in terms of the initial commissioning, the fallout, and then her own thoughts on the whole process. Just a little bit of scholarly pedantry. You see here the Can't Sag Gate. See, can you read that? So we climbed the Can't Sag Gate and went down to the riverbank, stopped there. I spent a week of my life trying to figure out if that was a typo or what the hell was a Can't Sag Gate. Thanks to Internet Archive and to my fantastic editor, we were able to locate, period ads about Can't Sag gates that are patented, and so that because they're of steel, they don't sag, so they cannot sag, right? This pedantry, though, helped me understand that Edith was hugely aware of her agrarian context. She knew her trees, so that sort of showed again that she was not some distracted individual that was dealing with that. Some of the material that I was able to use and publish includes like correspondence, but just quickly, even learning how to read tone and sort of expression, comparing these 2 letters where Edith wrote to me shortly after she met him, and she had decided to commission the house. See how she signs it, sincerely yours. The only handwritten part is her name. Then she gets her secretary to sign it. You move to the 4 or 5 months later, she's handwritten letter, signing off faithfully yours as opposed to sincerely yours. And so it demonstrates how their own relationship, not a sexual relationship or romantic relationship, but their professional relationship was progressing. And so, as a side note, when I work with my graphic designer, who just thought of these as images because graphic designers tend not to read what they're putting into a book, he wanted to put this letter 5 pages down. And I said it was only by putting them next to each other that one could understand fully what the evolution of their relationship. I'm not going to speak too much about this. Ron Henderson will talk about this beautiful black sugar maple in relationship to the house, except to say that the book, I wanted to bring in my friend Ron Henderson with a bit of coercion so that he could add a layer of expertise to the book, because landscape architects know their trees more than the architects themselves. To the extent that trees were important, I point to this sort of slide where I show a number of Mies on the right looking at the house surrounded by trees. This was the MoMA exhibition of 47. It was the only house that had a model like of the many houses, or a handful of houses or buildings rather, that were shown in the exhibition. This was the only house that was the model had trees demonstrating that they were part of the thinking of the architecture. Here if you compare, if you study the actual plan of the exhibition, understand that this shot that you see Mies and Johnson together is actually the same Farnsworth House site with the tree poking out. I mentioned earlier that the great challenge of understanding this house and its radical innovation is that you can't understand it by taking photos of it from outside in, but rather inside out. These are 2 significant photos, one by Lambros on the right with Peter Palumbo era, and the other early 1950s. You'll notice how Edith's pup was a little bit upset that he was not being let in for the photo shoot. Moving forward here, I'm sorry. So part of the argument against Edith, lacking in any kind of sophistication made by the men that were dismissing her involvement in the house, was around furniture, right? In the memoirs, she recounts how she was called by one of Mies' staff and said, "Your Barcelona chairs are ready to be delivered." Now, how many of you know what a Barcelona chair is? Okay, you'll see it. It's a famous, iconic chair that Mies designed for the 1929 Barcelona Pavilion, and it became a kind of iconic chair that then he began to use in many different buildings. So she promptly answered and said, "I've never ordered Barcelona chairs." To which the employee counter answered, "And therefore I don't want them." And then he said, "You will be sorry." So that started a whole conversation about why she didn't understand anything about interiors. But the fact of the reality is, and I'll just use this point, is she did choose very sophisticated mid-century furniture, including Jens Rism, Bureau Matheson lounge chairs, made of wood for the most part, because she understood this to be a country house. So just like you don't wear a tuxedo, or don't typically wear a tuxedo or a black evening dress to a country house, she did not want very formal furniture. She wanted to be a little bit more informal, more country-like. And so she chose this iconic little desk seen here with Edgar Kaufman Jr. at the MoMA, and Merchandise Mart organized good design. And so this is part of the story that has also not been told, which I endeavored to do. To prove the point regarding the difficulty around furniture and some of the lingering anti-German sentiment in post-World War II in America about this excess control over spaces that an architect like Mies was exerting. See, Alan Dunn, very witty cartoonist. There's a woman that's looking at her closet full of all beautiful objects. And then she asks her husband, have the photographers gone? So the idea here is that somehow, to be modern, you could not show any of your personal objects, right? Nothing more obvious is when we look at what the house became with its second life. The second owner, Peter Palumbo, seen here on the right, and a beautiful portrait by Elizabeth Ernst. See the return of the Mies daybed, the Tugendhat chairs, the background, and with the exception of maybe one Etruscan pot, an ancient pot, and a parson table, a lamp here or there. There was a kind of overly curated space where there's very little room for the person, right? I mentioned earlier that we were trying to position the Edith Farnsworth House into a bigger sort of development of the single-family house in America. My colleague and I wrote this book about 4 or 5 years ago, Modern in the Middle, and it talks about the number of modern single-family houses, including the Farnsworth, but not only. So much so that we included, of course, another Mies house that I'm happy to admit I knew nothing about before landing in Chicago, the McCormick House in Elmhurst, which is part of the Chicagoland. This was Mies's response to the Usonian. And here you see how the kind of austere, let's say, luxurious interiors of the Farnsworth have been somewhat toned down. In the place of Primavera, rare wood veneer. We have plywood in the core. In the place of travertine, we have cork floors. And here, if you haven't seen it, this ubiquitous Barcelona chair, which, like a horror movie, it never goes away. For those of you who have seen, Chicago interiors, you're inevitably destined to encounter one of those. So hard to escape. The house, this is about, open, another Mies house open to the public. It is open. It was subsequently moved, much to the surprise and horror of little kids, neighborhood kids, a couple blocks down, and is now part of the Elmhurst Art Museum, again, accessible to the larger public. The extent to which Edith's house began to be an instant model of repetition or homage is seen here. A. James Spire designed this house in Highland Park, just to the north of the Loop. Here too, using the sort of basic tenets of the Farnsworth House, but replacing the Apollonian white with the sort of rustic red to sort of camouflage it within the ravine forest. And this, for those of you who haven't been to Crown, Matt has been to Crown. He will recognize this. So, this is a mini Crown Hall on the banks of the Fox River in Geneva, built just 1 year after the Farnsworth. And you see here again what I was referring to, the Barcelona chairs that they cannot get rid of. I'll be quickly. So to the second life, I'm gonna almost wrapping up here. The second life of the house is associated with Edith's gradual decision to sell the house and retire to Italy. The tipping point that provoked her to do so, in addition to the anxiety and the sort of sadness associated with her relationship falling out with Mies, was the decision of the Illinois Department of Transportation to replace this beautiful 19th century truss bridge, one lane. In fact, you see the corresponding parrot with this very aggressive reinforced concrete highway that had the sort of very important role of getting much closer to the house. In fact, if you see this pier here, there it is. This was the original pier, and so this road came significantly closer to the house. So the conceit of being in a sort of agrarian, sort of peaceful environment was forever undermined by the loudness of sort of the cars passing by. She sold the house. I don't know how many architects are here in the room. Couple. So, to have your name on the for sale sign is a big deal. I don't know if you have ever seen one here in Evansville, but it's not a typical. So I made sure I use this kind of material to tell a more interesting, more complex story of how houses were sold, why they were sold. And here we see images of the house in abandon, little nostalgic images taken by Jim Zanzi, Chicago-based, before the house was actually sold to this gentleman here, Lord Peter Palumbo. And I've also included, photos of ads that went up in the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, selling the house. This is literally one of the archives. I found this, and someone had literally circled it to point out to that ad. So Edith decided she had enough of glass and steel, and she actually bought herself an early Renaissance palazzo. On the right, she left Chicago to move to Italy and live in the outskirts of Florence, where she translated poetry. Again, this extraordinary woman that had studied medicine, but also literature. This is maybe a side note, but I wanted to point out, I'm not quite certain why she chose Florence over, say, Rome or Venice, with the exception of the fact that just as she was choosing to leave for Italy, the Great Flood of November the 4th, 1966 happened in Florence. The water, of course, didn't get as high as this. This is a beautiful Archizoom collage, but nonetheless, I would make the case that she chose Florence over Rome and Venice to be part of the sort of international community that was working to save Florence from the flood. The second owner, Peter Palumbo, seen here on the left in a photo by Derry Moore, and his wife, Hayat Palumbo, came with a beautiful period of stewardship of the house, even though a little bit too curatorial. He wanted to make the house more Miesian than Mies, as we saw in that image of pulling out all of Edith's furniture. But there was great love, as attest to this pillow done by Hayat, who's a needlepoint artist. And these are the kind of things I included in the book to show affection and sort of personal history related to a site. Flooding was always a dimension that Palumbo had to deal with. He commissioned the Andy Goldsworthy, the artist, the English artist, to build this cairn that sort of symbolized or memorializes the 1954 flood. So 54, only 3 years after it was built, already flooding. And the most apocalyptic flood was 1996, seen here, helicopter view, and along the Shantung silk drapes the level of the house. We were in New Harmony, and the Athenaeum was being surrounded by water, but I think it'll take a long time before we go up there. Peter Palumbo working hard to restore the house here, but that was also a tipping point. He sold the house at auction in December of 2003. Subsequently, the passage to Landmarks Illinois, who holds the easement in the National Trust, led to the house being placed on the National Register for historic preservation, and also to its being deemed a national landmark. As a fun note, I don't know how many of you know the HABS program, Historic American Building Survey, 1930s era, Roosevelt era program, where buildings were measured and drawn in their current state, as opposed to just the drawings of the architects. They're also part of a photography campaign. I wanted to throw this one in the book to show that there was a time when people did live without Wi-Fi and had antennas. For the younger students here, it may seem hard to imagine or even know what that thing is, but again, a bit of history. And then finally, the last life of the house is associated with the ongoing need to restore it. This is the lower terrace, the travertine being replaced, corrosion. It's a much less sexier dimension of the lives of the house, but nonetheless an important one. And then finally, also the replacement of the glass. In the 50s, they didn't make tempered glass, which now insurance companies look askance to. So they have to replace. There's only two remaining panes of original glass, which points to the fact that authenticity is a relatively subjective concept. Thank you very much. At this point, I pass to my esteemed colleague and friend, Ron Henderson. And then I guess we will gladly, after take questions. Okay, so I'll get out of here, and then Ron, I think you are. Here you go.
Thank you, Michelangelo.
You're good.
So Michelangelo has covered a lot of ground. I'm going to talk about one thing. And so probably just for about 10 minutes. We were on a really lovely invited train ride in Japan, and Michelangelo was frantically responding to the publisher's editor. Get this book done, get this book done, get this book done. Those of you who know Michelangelo would also understand while he's being challenged to finish the book, he's also asking people to start writing for the book. So I was captive on a train for about three or 4 days. And he invited me to write about the landscape. And I was like, that's too complicated. I'll write about one tree. I teach a course called Planting and Design, right? I'm a landscape architect. And also one of the ways that I have students investigate the kind of power of trees as a design project is I give them a project called the One Tree Project, where they have to select the species of tree and design a space that amplifies or exaggerates the qualities of that one tree. This is a pretty good example of a one tree project. The chromatic resonance of this particular black maple, black sugar maple, certainly resonates in this space in the fall, in this mid-1980s photograph from Miller. I would just call your attention to, if you look at the middle of the tree, the trunk is cut off. So at different stages in its life, this tree has received pruning and other care. And I'll save the punchline for later. Here is a photograph that Michelangelo also showed. It's hard to give a talk about the Farnsworth House without including this, this image. And you can see the black sugar maple on the left. And that's Mies on the right. In this photograph, which Michelangelo also shared, you can see an array of trees. Scott Mahaffey, who is the executive director of the Farnsworth House now, and is also a landscape architect, kind of pointed our attention to probably that the black sugar maple is one of the trees at the leftmost part of this image, that the clearing might be about where the porch is, and the larger trees on the right along a little stream inlet where the boathouse is now. Floodplain, right? So you all know about floodplains here on the banks of the Wabash and the banks of the Ohio. You've got the normal flow of the river, then you have a kind of floodplain, and then you have bluffs or cliffs, and then you have another high floodplain, and the river kind of takes its capacity at different levels. So the Farnsworth House does sit just up above on a very shallow rise of the river. So anywhere along that topography, which you can begin to see in kind of outlined on the drawing on the right, could be the location of the house. So if you imagine that you could move the house up and down in a model until you find the right location, it's quite possible that there's another condition that's locking it into a place, a secondary condition. It might be easy to argue that it's the black sugar maple. It's really remarkable, I think, in the book to finally give Dr. Farnsworth her own voice through the inclusion of her journal. And it gives us evidence that perhaps there was influence on the location of the house from her. In her journal, she writes, "We walked down the riverbank where we found the most inviting easy chairs between the swelling roots of two immense black sugar maples, whose shade was repeated and extended by the hackberries, the lindens, and the walnut trees grouped about us. In the water, close to the shore, a milk-white heron stood, motionless, at the foot of his rippling image." End of quote. She also mentions the hackberries, the lindens, the walnut tree. Those are probably some of the other trees that showed up in the earlier photograph, according to Scott. As the commissioning client, she likely directed the attention of her architect to those trees. In a subsequent paragraph, she wrote of the impact these trees had on her and Sue Brill, a friend who joined her on her visit. She wrote, "I imagine that we both dreamed in the shade of the black sugar maple that night." This is just a sort of inventory of the history of the tree as it shows up in different images. So here it's a much more kind of scruffy landscape and a more verdant green landscape. Here you see the topographic survey, and you can see a little more clearly the topographic survey lines, the kind of group of lines bunched up just north of the river, and how the house would be sitting up just above those bundled topo lines, which would indicate that that would have been a common, say, flood line. As Michelangelo also indicated in this image that Mies sort of supervised, if you look in the upper right, you can see some really interesting things happening between the refractions and reflections and transparency of glass, right? This is a steel and glass house, the glass house. If you look on the ceiling of the house in the foreground, you actually see the canopy of the tree cast on the ceiling of the polished white plaster. If you look beyond that onto the ceiling of the porch, you get a slightly modeled, lighter version of that same refraction. And you also get transparency. So you get this very complex kind of kaleidoscope or funhouse of mirrors of the tree casting itself on different surfaces in the house. I, like Michelangelo and students that have joined us here who spend time in Crown Hall, know that relationship of trees to a glass building. There are days where we feel like we're in the clearing of a woods in our building. Now, who knew, but back in 1994, when I was in grad school, for Professor David Leatherbarrow, I did a theoretical investigation on the construction of shadows. And the project that I selected, or the project that I worked with Professor Leatherbarrow, was in fact the Farnsworth House. So here I am 30 years later. So those of you who are students, you never know be careful what you do, because it's going to continue to haunt you. The drawing has a series of the columns of historic Mies projects, an investigation of how the glass meets the columns in a way that the proximity of shadows and transparency to the structure is able to almost meet as if it were a truly cubic glass corner. And then on the lower drawing, you can see a kind of implied horizontal line composed of a bunch of glass precedent images of the flood. Well, this was 1994. The worst flood was 1996. So this drawing would need to be revised. And if you look at my drawing, you can see in the upper corner, from this historic photograph, how the refraction of the tree occupies the space of the reflection of the column on the right-hand side. So we get that column becoming a column of vegetation in the refraction. Which is a condition that continues to be investigated. Here's a recent book by Rena Dolnick, investigating, and you can kind of see how the shadows of the trees are cast upon the glass. Almost like Nabokov from the shadow of the waxwings slain by the false azure of the window pane, which is missing when the frame lacks the glazing. Here in this aerial, I don't know, Michelangelo, if this is from the same Cessna flight, probably. You can see the black sugar maple where its canopy has been blown out. But I just wanted to come back to this earlier image where you see the full tree in black and white, and that relationship between the tree and the house. So the house probably could have moved up along that ridge. It kind of got locked into place here around the black sugar maple, where the house sits slightly uphill from the tree, but the terrace comes down and encloses another side of it, kind of implying a courtyard, half of which is enclosed by architecture and half of which is enclosed by the landscape. The tree was removed in 2013, soon after the National Trust gained the property. Cuttings from the tree were propagated at the Morton Arboretum in Chicago, and new saplings emerged successfully, and a replacement tree was planted from that tree just a few years ago. The new tree, as those of you know, it's really hard to plant a tree exactly where a tree was before. The new tree is about 5 feet toward the river, but in the same line perpendicular to the house. The power of one individual tree, which isn't a Barcelona chair, right? You can buy a Barcelona chair, but you can't buy this tree. You can't relocate the tree, right? So the presence of the tree, in a way, to me, anchors and has anchored the Edith Farnsworth House, specifically on its site in this specific location, even before the house was constructed, when Dr. Farnsworth first visited the site. Thank you.
We are happy to take questions or informal or otherwise.
Yes, I have 2 questions. So first, architecturally, could you talk a little bit about the reasoning behind the stills? Was that purely because of flooding, But if that was the case, then it seemed to not have been, or not, it would not have worked, or it didn't work, like the flooding was even higher, or was there some symbolic meaning also behind that? And then the second question is, I think in the beginning, when you were introduced, you also have some background in urbanism. And from an urbanism standpoint, would you view this house differently and maybe from an architectural standpoint? Because if everyone in Chicago wanted a house like this, they needed a huge, I don't know, space. It would not have worked. Like the city would have been dead and everyone retreated into their glass houses with all that space. Or do you say urbanism rules don't apply here because this is not really urban? So therefore, yeah.
Well, I mean, this is clearly an elitist proposition. You know, some people, this is her second house. Some people don't have one house. It's a country house. And so given her status and, you know, profession, so she was able to afford the second house. So it's a very special, I wouldn't say typical proposition. I mean, the fact that, you know, there's in the history of last 500 years, there's plenty of people that have commissioned country houses. So because it is an elitist thing, I don't think we're in any risk of, I guess the biggest issue is like everyone wants this in the middle of the city, perhaps, you know, and that's when suburban sort of McMansions, but this is a very discreet thing. So,
I mean, one thing I would add is, so I live in a Mies design tower, a steel and glass tower. I'm on the 19th floor. And I can look out and not see, because I'm along the lake, and not see anyone else. But I can also walk in my window and see other buildings and other people. I'm trying to remember the name of the photographer, probably 5 or 6 years ago, that published an essay on the particular quality of Chicago high-rise domesticity. And it's actually remarkable. The legacy of high-rise living in Chicago post-Mies is actually exactly this. We probably remain the most transparent of all of the high-rise cities, where you can peer into the domesticity from building to building in a way that you don't in New York, where there's more limestone or more brick or more wall. So it may still be a particularly Chicago condition where the ratio of wall, the column, or the frame to the infill, but largely still being glazing, may be a kind of high-rise version of exactly that question.
Right.
It's really interesting how visible the domestic life in high rises in Chicago is compared to other cities.
right. I would add, like, so back to your issue of, so the 5 feet raising. So,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so.
Good question.
Okay. And so basically, that was the 100-year flood mark when they did the study. So that, you know.
Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah, there was there was also at some point a marker, I think they're called monuments, little things that show on the Truss Bridge. So what happened though is that along the Fox River Valley, you know, over the years, the land flanking the river has been built upon, and therefore some of the land that would have absorbed the water does not, and so it sends it downstream. So you know the 100-year mark has been changed because of development along the riverbank. So that has led to the increased precariousness. The other thing could part of the more interesting speculation around why did he actually have to place it that close to the river. There's plenty of land that he could have brought it up. So some think that was a bit of his conceit, because in fact there's a famous gouache where the house is like lifted on stilts, and then there's another version that is on the ground. So some think that that was just Mies, making an excuse for wanting it to be raised. So he put it closer, but clearly that contributes to its magic, and its site specificity.
One last comment on that. I think also if you look at the oeuvre of Mies, the buildings are typically established on a plinth or a platform. Even his early houses, which were built on sloping sites, he establishes a horizontal datum. One thing about coming to the upper Midwest is the land is already flat. The land is already a datum. And so I've always kind of wondered if this was just a kind of piano nobile version of not needing a platform, and simply elevating the ground above the ground in a ennobling kind of way, which he would have done otherwise in other projects.
And he has the lower terrace, that you get, so you step onto the lower terrace and then you step up through the house where the so-called porch. So there is also a sense of that. That's about it.
You've been waiting a long time for your question.
You didn't say the cause, what happened to the tree? The sugar maple, did it have seeds or what happened?
I've been told it was in decline.
Okay.
So am I. I think that, I think that's it. I think there was a decision made at some point that its qualities or its longevity was questionable. And a decision was made to remove it.
Yeah, I blame, you want to know the story that you don't write about? Well, welcome to litigation prone America, and also welcome to conservative insurance people that just want your money. And then, so clearly, as it was in decline, I am, now we should ask Scott this, well, that predates him. I would bet you money that the insurance people said, there's a risk here. We are not going to insure you unless you deal with it. The same way they were saying, well, the tempered glass, well, that's real. So I have a feeling that while it truly was in decline, it might have been accelerated by this kind of very fear, inclined. I have a story. There's a colleague of mine, Fred Noyes, who father Elliot Noyes designed a beautiful courtyard house in New Canaan. It was all surrounded by very tall pine trees. They forced the guy, this was about 5 years ago, to cut them all down because they weren't going to give him, they weren't going to insure the house. So I think that's also an indictment on insurance, to not understand certain, that not understand that you have special architecture, and a little bit you have to be willing to also have a little bit of faith that the worst case scenario is not going to happen instead of maybe the best case.
I'm just hoping it's not because the architect said you can't see the building because the tree's in there.
No, I doubt it. Oh, go ahead.
A couple of questions. One, why was this style considered kind of subversive? Was it the German part, or was it the fact that there was no privacy in the house? And then relatedly, I've noticed that a lot, and again, I'm not this kind of the style mid-century modern more popular in the Midwest. Is that the case? Because whenever I go out to the east, there's always hedgerows, and you can't really see inside the houses. When the Midwest is much more certain openness, and I don't know if it's a Midwestern this style.
Well, I'll answer my part and see what Ron's.
Yeah.
When you
Modern
think
in the middle.
yeah,
You wrote the book.
right. So, but I'll turn around since you're a professor. Why don't you answer the question for yourself? Think about it. So when's the last time that you were in a house that had floor to ceiling glass? That kind of spatial experience is more typical for a, an office building, right? So I think that was the typical associations with domesticity, comfort. Like steel is a hard material, and so is glass, and so there's a level of the material palette is certainly what contributes to its being foreignness. Like even Frank Lloyd Wright would never. In fact, it's fun account where Frank Lloyd Wright, we have it, and I put it in the memoir as part of it, where Frank Lloyd Wright visits the 1947 show with Mies, and he writes that negation is not enough, right? Because that was whole. Mies is sort of a bit of a cliche, but some don't even believe it was his statement. Less is more, and so almost nothing. So in a way, the conceit was you were doing buildings that were defying gravity, defying like expectations. So through the technological thing, but back to us about, so that's not the kind of, typical American material palette. So if you compare it to Wright being the most American, in fact, so Frank Lloyd Wright, Falling Water gets 100,000 visitors. This gets like 10, 12, if you're lucky, 12,000. So Americans haven't really kind of embraced this kind of thing.
Chicago.
Yeah, yes, although again, the memoirs say it really nicely where Mies she had asked him, like, what kind of materials should we use? Well, he said, well, if we were in the city, then we would do a courtyard in the middle to let in light or opaque glass. But since we're in the country and no one's here, we can use full transparency. Okay. So I think Mies was also aware of the site being something that he didn't imagine, though, and this is a fun story, and that's what, much to her consternation, like the house became an instant icon, and people were just obsessed. And she would say they would show up in groups that would just trespass, right? Because and a bit of desire. She said it was shocking for her that people would just assume that they could do that, but it really, thanks to photography, and one of the arguments I make, that photography, basically was the vehicle, because the house wasn't open. It completed in 51. The house wasn't open until 204. So basically, for more than 50 years, with few exceptions, Palumbo was very generous in letting people in a little bit, but the general audience of profession basically based their assessments on pictures, as opposed to actually in situ visits. If you want to contribute to that.
Amazing. Thank you all for the invitation, the hospitality. Good questions. Friendships.
Thank you very much.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Oh, okay. Thank you, sir, as usual. And
That's great.
okay, should I close that?
Thank you.
Yeah, just push in there and then it should, yeah, and webinar for all.
And